Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Johanna Amos and Julia McArthur to speak. This is a collaborative paper, and they'll be presenting it half and half. That's it. Thanks, Johanna. Dr. Johanna Amos specializes in 19th century British art and material culture, with a particular focus on the pre-Raphaelites and the arts and crafts movement. In the spring of 2014, she completed her PhD in art history at Queen's University with a dissertation entitled The Burden of the Image, Jane Morris in Art and Life. This work explores the relationship between pre-Raphaelite model Jane Burden Morris and her painted representation, and considers the role of art in the fashioning of identity during the aesthetic movement. Johanna has presented aspects of this research at conferences in the UK and Canada, and she has taught at both Queen's and NASCAD universities. And her courses cover feminist art history and the history of fashion and textiles. Julia McArthur is an artist and an independent scholar. She graduated with her MA in art history in 2010 from Queen's University. Her thesis is entitled Harriet Ford, New Women in an Old Toronto. New Women Artist in an Old Toronto. Subjects of interest include Canadian historical women artists, enigmatic jewelry, Elizabethan portraiture, and contemporary Kingston artists. It's kind of it's like a crazy cool mix of interests. Julia will read the first half of their paper, An Enigmatic Likeness, a Posy for Harriet Ford, and Johanna the second half. Please join me in welcoming Johanna and Julia.
In 1890, the Canadian painter and decorative artist Harriet Mary Ford exhibited a self-portrait simply titled My Portrait at the Paris Salon. It was shown again 5 years later at the Royal Canadian Academy exhibition in Toronto, yet little else is known about the work. The current location of this painting, if it even survives, remains a mystery, and the exhibition catalogues associated with its display provide no description of the work's features. However, it is possible that, like many artists before her, Ford produced a professional portrait depicting herself with the tools of her trade, an artist's palette, maul, canvas, and brush. Indeed, in a photograph taken later in life, Ford chose to represent herself in this manner. Photographed in her garden, Ford appears in neat summer attire, her sketch pad and pencil at the ready. Although unfortunate, the absence of Ford's self-portrait also presents us with an opportunity, as it forces us to consider other images and objects as material remnants of Ford's identity. In this paper, we examine an item of jewelry, specifically a gold ring, that belonged to Ford as an alternative form of self-representation, set with nacre and pink coral and inscribed with the motto, "No hap so hard as love debarred." The Ford ring represents a puzzle. Unlike the descriptive images typically associated with self-portraiture, the Ford ring offers only suggestions and illusions, pointing indirectly to the influences and interests that shaped the artist's life. In his now well-known essay, Style as Evidence, Jules Brown suggested that style could be used to determine the unstated assumptions, attitudes, and values of society, further arguing that such evidence was most readily perceived in the decorative arts, in objects that were not consciously purposeful. Painting, Brown argued, was too heavily loaded with content. Portraits are similarly constructed. They exist, as Marcia Poynton describes, at a peculiar nexus of psychic and social conditions, and are subject to convention, style, protocol, and staging, as both artists considered determine how to visually describe an identity. Like the photograph of Ford in her garden, portraits often articulate details that the sitter wishes to be known, a professional identity, social status, or rank. This is especially the case for portraits made for public consumption. Looking to the decorative arts, then, as Brown suggests, as a possible form of portraiture, might allow us to see an individual differently. We might notice not what the author chooses to demonstrate, but the more intimate and unconscious elements of an individual's identity. In this paper, we propose that the Ford ring fulfills both public and private functions of portraiture, that it alludes to Ford's status as a professional female artist at the turn of the century, and that it offers insight into Ford's domestic and romantic life. Through an exploration of the material properties and physical qualities of the ring, we hope to reveal the complexities of Ford's identity, both as a female professional and a private individual. Harriet Ford was an active member of the arts community in Canada and England at the turn of the century. She belonged to the Royal Canadian Academy, the Ontario Society of Artists, and the St. Ives Art Club. Known primarily as a painter, Ford was also a vocal critic and experimented with graphic design and various decorative art forms. In the early 20th century, Ford gained attention for her work as a jeweler. Art historian Jennifer Watson speculates that Ford learned the craft while in England, where she lived from 1896 to 1911. An Art Notes column from 1908 in the Toronto Star supports this, reporting that the jeweler's art is claiming all the attention of Miss Harriet Ford in her studio at Great Marlow near London. The article went on to note that a number of pieces of Ford's work had previously been exhibited in Toronto, probably at the 1905 exhibition of the Canadian Society of the Applied Arts, with great success, indicating that Ford was a skilled practitioner by this point. Ford worked primarily in silver and with semi-precious stones, but also occasionally in gold. The Ford ring is currently in the collection of Ford's grandniece and entered the collection along with several other pieces of Ford's decorative work. As with the majority of Ford's art, there are no surviving documents associated with the ring. However, there are unique material factors that point to Ford's hand in the design. The gold band itself was manufactured in Canada, as indicated by the maker's mark. While this seemingly complicates the attribution to Ford, in the instant of jewelry design and execution were often undertaken by different individuals, and a designer's involvement can only be confirmed by other means. Unusually here, the maker's mark interrupts an inscription that is English in origin and which suggests a knowledge of the British craft revival. This association is furthered by the style of the settings and the choice and cut of the materials, natural and semi-precious, and similar to Ford's other decorative work. Like Ford, the ring occupies a peculiar place between England and Canada. The ring itself can be classified as a posy ring, a medieval form of jewellery that became particularly popular in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. Posy rings could be plain or ornamented, were typically made of gold, and crucially contained a motto or inscription, hence the name Posy, after the French poésie for poetry. Ordinarily, these inscriptions were engraved on the inside of the band, and therefore known only to the wearer. Traditionally, posy rings were used to mark major life events, particularly betrothals and weddings. Examples of these rings in the collection of the British Museum bear inscriptions which confirm their use as love tokens. I give it thee, my love to be, and like this, my love shall endless prove. Inscriptions could be the result of the giver's own devising, but there were a few popular mottos. In 1624, a number of these mottos were gathered together and published in a small volume entitled Love's Garland, or Poesies for Rings, Handkerchiefs, and Gloves, and Such Pretty Tokens that Lovers Send Their Loves. The inscription on Ford's ring, no hap so hard as love debarred, is among those included in the collection. And while the British Museum did acquire an 18th century example of a posy ring with this motto in 1897, a more likely source for the Ford inscription is one of the reprints of the 17th century volume that was published in England at the turn of the 19th century. Collectors and antiquarians became interested in posy rings at this time, and in addition to the reissue of Love's Garland, the then president of the Society of Antiquaries, John Evans, gave a lecture on posy rings at the Royal Institution in March of 1892. This lecture was published in Longman's magazine in May of the same year. Art historian Joan Evans suggests that this interest resulted in a gradual revival of the tradition, and it seems that the quality of these rings would have appealed to those who championed the medieval revival or the production of craft jewellery, which often imitated historical techniques or styles. The form of the inscription in the Ford ring also suggests an alignment with these interests. The spelling is deliberately archaic, and the lettering assumes a Gothic appearance. The materials that ornament the surface of the Ford ring coral and mother of pearl also suggest a link to the alternative art movements that swept Britain in the second half of the 19th century. Coral in particular was popular with the artists associated with the Pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic movements, and appears in several works by Dante Gabriel Rossetti and William Holman Hunt. Other semi-precious stones, including amber and pearls, also ornament these papers, and by the 1880s, these and other natural materials such as shells and pebbles had become an important element of the artistic style in women's fashion. In addition, these materials were also common in the work of arts and crafts or craft revival jewelers with whom Ford can be associated. The ring, however, is not the only evidence of Ford's interest in the avant-garde approaches pursued overseas. Many of Ford's paintings demonstrate parallels to pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic works. Ford was particularly experimental in the 1890s. In Ford's portrait of her niece Grace Carney, for instance, she tested James McNeill Whistler's tonal palette and similarly employed the use of stylistic devices borrowed from Japanese art, the long format asymmetry and calligraphic lettering. A later portrait of Ford's companion Edith Hayes, provisionally titled Santa Maria and exhibited at the RCA in 1898, demonstrates an obvious debt to the Pre-Raphaelites and is particularly reminiscent of Rossetti's early oil, Ecce and Scylla Domini. The criticism of Ford's figural work also recalled that leveled at the Pre-Raphaelites. Reporting on Ford's Annunciation and an unnamed work in 1895, a reviewer described the formlessness of outline and the apparent disregard of physical beauty in representation of the human form, which seems the snares into which adherents of this style are most likely to fall. However, perhaps the most avant-garde of these stylistic experiments was Ford's winning design for the Toronto Horse Show poster of 1896. The influence of the late aesthetic decadent artist Aubrey Beardsley is evident in this piece, a daring depiction of a horsey woman in front of the Toronto Armories. The poster's use of contrasting hues, royal blue and yellow, juxtapositional perspective, and a figure of non-classical proportions all echoes devices regularly employed by Beardsley. Even the Globe picked up the reference, noting that entries for a subsequent poster contest lacked originality and novelty and displayed no evidence of Aubrey Beardsleyism. Despite the suggestion of approval, Ford's horseshoe poster was criticized in the press and was labeled a joke and a crime. While Ford's experimentation with styles and techniques popular in Europe reflects her own interest in developing a Canadian school of art which was open to and interacted with the best approaches emerging elsewhere, it seems that not all in the Canadian art establishment shared her view. Indeed, in 1920, a reviewer for the Globe recalled Ford's earlier artistic output, which at the time was labeled dangerous. Towards the end of the 19th century, Ford also seems to have become increasingly frustrated with attaining recognition as a professional artist. Although she was elected an associate member of the RCA in 1895, full membership would never be awarded to Ford nor to her female peers. In addition, the medium and subject matter of Ford's work shifted in the early part of the 20th century. Oil paintings were replaced by watercolors and figural subjects by landscape scenes. Thus, towards the end of her life, Ford seems to have accepted the expectations and limitations placed on women artists of the time. However, if Ford felt frustrated as a painter, jewelry making may have offered her the status and professional reputation she seems to have desired.
I think I need your mic. Around them? Sorry. How's that for sound? You can hear okay? Perfect. Okay. While jewelry making, like other forms of metalwork, had been a male-dominated activity, this changed with it. We're now linked physically as well. This changed with the craft revival at the end of the 19th century. The increasing acceptance of women in this field was partly premised on the circumstance that the skills required for the craft did not contradict stereotypical views of femininity. However, as Lynn Walker has argued, this kind of stereotyping, which saw the work as an extension of the maker's femininity, reinforced the connection between biology and creativity. But at the same time, women worked against the ideological grain by using this craft not as an amateur pursuit, but as an area in which they could practice as professionals. In Britain, many women, including Phoebe Trackware, who I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, Mae Morris, and Georgie Gaskin, were recognized for their work in jewelry, as were Mary Bell Eastlake and Mabel Adamson in Canada. Like her peers, Ford also seems to have found success in this branch of the decorative arts. In 1912, the Toronto Star praised the range of items made after the artist's craftsman's own designs, and a later article in the same paper reported that Ford's hand-wrought jewelry and quaint setting of Canadian semi-precious stones were eagerly sought and bought as soon as exhibited. The Ford ring thus alludes to Ford's affinity for artistic experimentation at this time. But just as the ring itself has two surfaces, one visible to the world, the other known only to the wearer, Ford's ring, we speculate, alludes to her private existence as much as to her public life. In Love's Garland, the 17th century book of posy mottos, the text from Ford's ring is listed as suitable for a ring for a crossed lover. Had Ford been frustrated in love? Or, as Ford is not known to have had any significant romantic relationships, might this be a reference to Ford's relationship to the English artist Edith Hayes? Ford likely met Hayes in the late 1880s, when both were students at St. John's Wood Art School in London. In 1889, Ford and Hayes traveled together to Paris to study, and in 1890 they were together again at St. Ives, joining the nascent art colony there and becoming founding members of the St. Ives Art Club. In the mid-1890s, Ford returned to Toronto, but by the end of the decade, she and Hayes were staying and painting at Newlyn, and in the early 1900s, when Ford and Hayes were in their early 40s, they purchased a house and studio near Marlow, England. They named the home Drift, likely after the ridge near Newlyn, which was a favorite painting spot for artists. Although Ford did periodically return to Canada after this date, she and Hayes remained at Drift for the rest of their lives, and their wills indicate the extent to which they shared this property. Ford and Hayes also painted each other on several occasions, a gesture which Susan Butlin interprets as a sign of affection. Like many women who chose to live with female companions at this time, Ford and Hayes have been the source of some speculation. Aside from their wills and a handful of newspaper articles, there are few documentary sources that reference Ford's relationship to Hayes. The newspaper accounts do, to some extent, provide evidence for the constancy with which Ford and Hayes shared their lives, yet Hayes is always described as Ford's friend, suggesting that to the outside world at least, they were artist friends who shared a home and studio for professional, economic, and social reasons. Yet without documentary evidence, an understanding of the exact nature of the relationship remains impossible. As Christina Huneau, who is here in the back, asks in her study of Helen McNichol, an artist with a similarly ambiguous relationship, were these women lovers who experienced their partnership in terms of a full-lived sexuality? Were they romantic friends, passionately attached but untouched by modern conceptions of lesbianism? Were they colleagues and comrades who lived together for mutual support and convenience, or were they all three at different times or simultaneously? Again, the material aspects of the Ford ring might point toward a more passionate form of attachment. While both mother of pearl and coral carry a range of associations, coral in particular is embedded in a rich system of signification. In Europe in the 16th century, coral often featured prominently on items for children, as it was regarded as a powerful amulet capable of warding off the evil eye. However, coral could also be negatively construed. In classical mythology, it was thought to have originated with the Gorgon Medusa, and there's tons of these things floating around in the 19th century. After slaying the monster, Perseus is said to have laid her head in the sea, and her blood colored the seaweed, turning it to stone. In addition, because of its arterial appearance, coral was commonly associated with the interior of the body and with death. These allusions continued to resonate in the 19th century. As Marcia Pointon writes, coral remained a gem whose beauty was tinged with premonitions of disaster, a substance which invariably evoked contradictory and dissonant meanings. The presence of coral on the Ford ring, then, might echo the ring's inscription, indicating that love could be both welcome and unsanctioned, desired and disastrous. Mother of pearl, coral's watery companion, is derived from the inside layer of mollusk shells and provides a potential link to love and pleasure, and obviously the most sort of iconic image of this. Because of their generative properties, seashells provide an obvious reference to female anatomy. As Pointon states, female sexual parts have often been associated with the soft interior of the pearl-producing oyster. In exploring this association, we do not mean to definitively suggest that Ford experienced lesbian desire in the modern sense, but rather that the ring's materials could possibly allude to an erotic concern with the female body. Moreover, coral and mother of pearl were both difficult substances to classify. Nacre was at once animal and mineral, coral, animal, mineral, and vegetable. Might this aspect of these materials have also appealed to a woman who did not feel at home in the dominant model of femininity or with the normative category of heterosexual marriage? The possibility that Ford wore this ring, particularly if he wore it as Posy Rings were historically intended, and photographs suggest that Ford was accustomed to actually wearing a ring on her ring finger. Further speculation about the object's personal significance. At the end of the 19th century, the same circumstances that necessitated and encouraged women's pursuits in the arts industries also made it unremarkable for two women to live together. However, this might also have created a problem of representation for those who chose to share their lives for more complex reasons. As Katrina Rowley notes in her analysis of lesbian dress at the turn of the century, a multitude of institutions and traditions served to validate the heterosexual couple. They were welded together by legal documents, religious ceremonies, cohabitation, the production of children, shared names, and a shared grave, and until recently, such a union could be extremely difficult to dissolve. No such institutions, ceremonies, or traditions existed to validate the lesbian couple. How then, Rowley asks, could two women indicate that their union was a free and deliberate choice, and how could they assert their status as a couple to every chance acquaintance and casual observer? Although the Ford ring is a less overt symbol than the masculine dress and sympathetic styling examined by Rowley, might it also, particularly in its similarities to a wedding band, suggest a subtle desire to be recognized as half of a whole, or at the very least, to be regarded as romantically unavailable. Brown argues that objects allow us to understand the past differently. As he writes, through objects we see with their eyes and touch with their hands. However, as the Ford ring shows, an object can also raise more questions than it answers. While this ring hints at an artist between Canada and England, a professional who was interested in the alternative art movements of the 19th century, and an individual whose love didn't find acceptance, it tells us none of these things explicitly or with certainty. What we offer here is only one possible interpretation of the Ford ring. Considering this object as a self-portrait is therefore not without its obstacles. Its lack of a signature or physical likeness to its owner makes its relationship to a particular individual unstable. However, in this way, it also reminds us to be attentive to the dangers of mapping biography onto a work of art. As Christina Huneau warns, representation is never a transparent gateway to the self. The Ford ring offers us little in the way of solid ground, but it does provoke us to keep questioning the archive. Thank you.